My name is Elena Marlowe. And there are nights I wish I had never come back to that stable, but the truth is, that night would have found me anyway. I remember the exact moment my car headlights cut across the gravel driveway. The beams slid over the weathered wooden fence, the sagging roofline of the barn, and the silver mist hanging low over the pasture like breath from something ancient. It was nearly midnight. The world was quiet in the way only the countryside can be quiet, thick, patient, almost listening. I turned off the engine. For a moment I just sat there with my hands resting on the steering wheel. The ticking of the cooling engine sounding far too loud in the silence. I hadn't been back in almost a year, not since the day everything had unraveled. The barn looked smaller than I remembered. Older too. The paint had peeled away in long pale scars. And the wide sliding doors leaned slightly to one side like tired shoulders. This place used to feel enormous when I was younger, back then. The smell of hay and leather meant freedom, back then. I believed I would never leave, but life has a quiet way of rearranging your plans while you're busy believing in them. A cold breeze drifted through the cracked window and brushed against my face. It carried the familiar scent of damp earth and dry hay. My chest tightened to God. I knew that smell. For a second it was like time folded in on itself. I could see myself again at 16, hair tangled from the wind, laughing breathlessly as hoofs thundered across the open field. I could hear the steady rhythm beneath me, the strength, the trust, and him. I swallowed and forced myself to move. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out of the car. The night air was colder than I expected, sharp enough to sting my lungs. Above me, the moon hung low and pale, trapped behind drifting clouds. It cast long shadows across the pasture. I shut the car door gently, almost automatically, like I was afraid of waking something. The stable lights were off. That didn't surprise me. Old Mr. Halvorson had sold most of the horses months ago. The farm had been struggling long before I left. Now only a few remained, and one of them. My chest tightened again. I hadn't told anyone I was coming tonight, not even Mr. Halvorson especially. Not him, because I wasn't here to visit. I was here to say goodbye. I walked slowly toward the barn doors. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground itself was trying to slow me down. The wooden boards creaked when I pulled the door open. The sound echoed through the dark interior. Inside, the familiar smell wrapped around me instantly: hay, leather, dust, and the warm, earthy scent of horses, even in the dimness. My body remembered this place. My shoulders relaxed without permission. A small lantern hung near the entrance. I struck a match and lit it, the warm glow pushing back the darkness just enough to reveal the long aisle of stalls. Most of them were empty, their gates stood open like quiet mouths. I walked slowly down the aisle. My boots thudded softly against the packed dirt floor. Every step stirred old memories of their third stall on the left. That's where Daisy used to live. She had a habit of stealing carrots straight from your pockets. Further down, Storm, the stubborn gray gelding who hated everyone except the barn cat. My throat tightened. So many ghosts in one building. Then I heard it. A soft shuffle. A quiet breath. I stopped. The sound came from the far end of the barn. For a moment neither of us moved. Then a dark shape shifted inside the last stall. My heart began to pound, even before I saw him clearly. I knew, some bonds don't fade with time, some presences you feel before you see. I walked slowly toward the stall. The lantern light flickered across the wooden rails, and then he stepped forward. His coat was black as midnight, catching the faint light like polished stone. His mane fell thick and slightly tangled along his neck. Older now, stronger somehow, but unmistakable. Hey, boy, I whispered. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. The horse lifted his head slowly, his ears turned toward me, and those eyes, deep, dark, steady eyes that had watched me grow from a reckless girl into someone I barely recognized. For a moment neither of us moved. Then he took a single step closer to the stall door. The wood creaked under his weight. My chest tightened painfully. Hatless. I breathed. The name felt fragile on my tongue. I rested my hand against the stall gate. He lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring as he breathed in my scent. I laughed quietly under my breath. You remember me? Of course he did. Horses remember everything. I opened the stall gate Slowly, the hinges groaned. Atlas didn't move away. He simply watched me, that same steady gaze. I stepped inside, the lantern light painted long golden lines across his coat. That up close, I could see the subtle changes time had left behind. A faint scar near his shoulder. The muscles along his neck thicker now that he was older, but the presence, the quiet gravity he carried, was exactly the same. I reached out slowly and rested my hand against his neck, warm, solid, real. The moment my fingers touched his coat, something inside me cracked open. I hadn't realized how much I missed this, the simple weight of a horse breathing beside you, the grounding certainty of it. Atlas exhaled softly, his breath brushed against my shoulder. I leaned my forehead gently against his neck. For a moment, the world went quiet. No expectations, no decisions, no future pressing down on my chest. Just this, just him. I'm leaving, I murmured. The words sounded strange in the dark. Atlas flicked one ear. I mean it this time, I added quietly. The truth settled heavy in the air between us. I had already packed the CARDMY apartment lease in the city. Started next week. A new job. A new life. A clean break from the girl who once thought horses were the center of the universe. I stroked his neck slowly. You'll be fine, I said softly, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince. Atlas shifted his weight slightly. The stall creaked. I stepped back and looked at him. You'll probably end up somewhere better than this old place anyway. He watched me, unblinking, the way horses do when they're paying attention to something deeper than words. I sighed. Don't look at me like that. He didn't move. The lantern flame flickered outside. The wind brushed against the barn walls. With a low whisper, for a moment I thought about leaving right then, just turning around, walking back down the aisle, driving away, clean, simple, final. But Atlas stepped forward suddenly, not aggressively, just enough that his chest pressed gently against me. I laughed quietly. Hey, easy. But he didn't step back. He stood there as solid as a wall, his head lowered slightly until his nose brushed against my shoulder. The weight of the moment caught me off guard. You're acting weird tonight, I murmured. Atlas exhaled again, warm breath against my neck. I tried to move around him. He shifted sideways, blocking the stall opening. I blinked. Atlas, I nudged his shoulder lightly. Move. He didn't, not even an inch. I tried again. Come on, big guy. Still nothing, for a horse who could move 1,000 pounds of muscle with a flick of intention. The stillness felt deliberate. I stepped back. He watched me. Something in his posture had changed, subtle, but unmistakable, alert, focused, like he was waiting for something. A strange unease crept along my spine. All right, I muttered softly. You win. I leaned against the wooden rail of the stall and crossed my arms. Atlas relaxed slightly but didn't move away from the doorway. The lantern flame trembled outside. A distant owl called into the night. Minutes passed. Or maybe longer. Time felt different inside that barn, slower, heavier. Atlas eventually turned his head and nudged my shoulder again, not forcefully, just a quiet reminder of his presence. I ran a hand through my hair and sighed. You always did this, you know. He flicked his ear when I was upset. My voice softened without meaning to. You'd stand in my way until I stopped pretending everything was fine. A memory surfaced suddenly. 17 years old, crying after my first major riding competition went wrong. Atlas refusing to move from the stall door until I stopped pacing and finally leaned against him the way I was doing now. I closed my eyes briefly. That was a long time ago. Atlas nudged me again, gentler this time, like he disagreed. I laughed quietly. You're impossible. But something in my chest had started to loosen, just a little. The tension that had followed me for months seemed less sharp inside the quiet rhythm of the stable outside. Clouds drifted slowly across the moon, the barn darkened slightly, Atlas remained where he was, watching, waiting, and though I couldn't explain it then, I had the strange, unsettling feeling that this night wasn't going to end the way I thought it would, because Atlas wasn't just standing in that doorway by accident, he was keeping me there, and somehow, deep down, I knew he wasn't planning to let me go, not that night. Atlas wasn't just standing in that doorway by accident. He was keeping me there, and somehow, deep down, I knew he wasn't planning to let me go, not that night. The thought should have sounded ridiculous. Horses didn't scheme. They didn't make decisions about human lives. They reacted, they sensed moods. They mirrored energy, but the way Atlas stood there felt deliberate, solid, unmovable, like the quiet gravity of a mountain. I pushed away from the stall rail and stepped toward him again, determination rising in my chest. "All right," I muttered under my breath. "We're not doing this all night." Atlas watched me calmly, his dark eyes reflected the lantern light in two small golden sparks. I placed both hands against his shoulder and nudged him sideways. "Move, big guy." Nothing, not a muscle. He wasn't tense. He wasn't resisting with force, he was simply not moving, like the idea of stepping aside had never crossed his mind. I exhaled through my nose and laughed quietly. "Seriously?" Atlas blinked slowly, the barn creaked softly around us as the wind brushed along the outer walls. "Atlas." I pushed again. Harder this time, his hoof shifted slightly on the dirt floor. But instead of stepping away from the doorway, he stepped closer to me, blocking it even more. I stared at him. "Oh. Come on." He lowered his head slightly and nudged my shoulder again. The motion was almost affectionate, which somehow made it worse. "You're unbelievable." For a moment I considered grabbing a lead rope and physically guiding him aside, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the calm steadiness in his posture, or the quiet certainty in his eyes. He wasn't agitated. He wasn't restless. He was patient, like he had already decided something, and he was willing to wait for me to figure it out. I leaned my back against the stall rail again and looked up at the dim rafters. "You're stalling," I murmured. The lantern flickered faintly, dust drifted through the warm light in tiny floating specks. The barn smelled exactly the way it always had: hay, leather, and the comforting warmth of horses. I had forgotten how grounding it felt. City air always carried something sharp and distant. Here the air felt alive, real. Atlas shifted slightly beside me, the movement brushed his shoulder against my arm. I glanced over at him. "You think this changes anything?" He blinked, slow, calm. The silence stretched. "You always had terrible timing," I said quietly. My voice echoed faintly through the empty stalls. I turned my head and looked down the aisle again. So many empty spaces, so many memories. This place used to feel loud, alive, horses snorting, hooves stomping, people laughing. Now it was mostly quiet, just me and him. Atlas nudged my shoulder again. This time I didn't react, I stared straight ahead. "You know why I left?" I said softly, the words hung in the air. Atlas exhaled slowly, warm breath brushed across my sleeve. I couldn't stay. Saying it out loud felt strange, like speaking a language I hadn't practiced in years. Everything was falling apart. The memory rose up before I could stop it. The last competition, the fall, the sharp crack of pain through my leg, the doctor's voice afterward, calm, careful, you'll ride again, Elena. But competing professionally, that might not be realistic anymore. Those words had landed like stones in my chest. Years of training, years of dreaming, and suddenly the path I had built my entire life around simply disappeared. I swallowed hard. I didn't belong here anymore. Atlas's ears flicked. I glanced at him. "You don't get that, do you?" He tilted his head slightly. The lantern flame danced again. "You were always exactly what you were meant to be," I continued. My hand rested absently against the wooden rail. "A horse runs. That's what he does. No expectations beyond that." Atlas shifted his weight. The floor creaked softly. "But people," I exhaled. "People build these huge lives around things. Dreams, plans, careers, and when they break," I stopped. The words refused To come out, Atlas nudged my shoulder again this time a little firmer. I closed my eyes briefly. You think I'm being dramatic? He snorted. Quietly, the sound made me smile despite myself.
Yeah.
I figured. I ran a hand down his neck slowly, his coat was warm under my fingers. Alive, steady. You remember the first time I rode you? Atlas flicked one ear toward me. I was terrified. The memory felt so clear it was almost painful. 16 years old, standing beside a massive black horse who looked more like a storm cloud than a riding partner. Diamar Halvorsen had smiled and handed me the reins. Trust him, he said, trust him. Simple words, hard lesson. I thought you were going to throw me straight into the dirt, I murmured. Atlas lowered his head slightly, but you didn't. He had carried me that day with the same calm strength he carried now, step by step, patient, steady, until the fear dissolved into something else, confidence, freedom. I leaned my forehead against his neck again. The warmth spread through my chest. You were always better at believing in me than I was. Atlas breathed slowly. The rhythm of it felt grounding, like standing beside the tide of the ocean. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. The barn doors rattled faintly. I lifted my head and looked toward the entrance. Clouds were drifting across the moon. Again, the light inside the barn dimmed. A strange feeling settled into the quiet, not fear exactly, but something close. The sense that the night itself was watching. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned sharply toward the open barn doors. What is it? I murmured. He stood very still, listening. The wind rustled through the pasture grass outside. Somewhere in the distance a branch snapped. I frowned. Probably a deer. Or just the wind. Atlas remained alert, muscles tense under his dark coat. Relax, I said softly. I rested my hand against his shoulder again. The tension slowly eased from his posture, but he didn't move away from the stall entrance, still blocking it, still keeping me exactly where I was. You're stubborn tonight, I muttered. He blinked. Another long moment passed. Then something shifted inside me. A quiet realization. Maybe it was the stillness, maybe it was the memories pressing in from every corner of the barn. Or maybe it was simply the fact that Atlas hadn't left my side for a single second since I walked in. But suddenly the idea of leaving right now felt wrong, too abrupt, too final. I sighed and slid down the stall rail until I was sitting on the dirt floor. Atlas watched me carefully. Well, I said quietly, if you're not letting me go yet, I guess we're staying a little longer. He lowered his head slightly. The gesture almost looked like approval. I rested my arms across my knees and looked down the long aisle again. The lantern light barely reached the far end. Darkness pooled in the empty stalls. You know what the worst part was? I murmured. Atlas flicked his ear. Not the injury. My voice felt fragile in the quiet, the silence afterward. When the competition stopped, when the training ended, when the calls stopped coming, people moved on quickly in that world. New riders, new champions, new stories at hand. Suddenly the girl who had once been promising was just forgotten. I stared at the dirt floor. I didn't know who I was without it. Atlas lowered his head again. His nose brushed gently against the top of my head. The contact startled me slightly. Hey. But I didn't move away. His breath warmed my hair. The steady presence wrapped around me like a quiet shield. I thought leaving would fix it, I whispered. A long silence followed. Atlas shifted one hoof slightly. The sound echoed softly. You ever notice how running away never actually works? He exhaled again, warm, steady, like he had always known. That I leaned back against the rail and closed my eyes. For a moment the world narrowed to simple things. The smell of hay, the distant wind outside, of the quiet breathing of a horse beside me, and for the first time in months, the pressure in my chest. Eased just a little, but Atlas still stood in the doorway, still watching, still refusing to let the night end, and somewhere deep inside the quiet barn, beneath the drifting lantern light and the patient rhythm of hooves shifting in the dirt, I began to realize something strange. Atlas hadn't trapped me here, not really. He had simply made it impossible for me to run, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what I needed, and maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what I needed. The thought lingered in the quiet barn like dust suspended in lantern light. I didn't move for a long time. Atlas stood beside me, still guarding the stall entrance like a silent sentinel. His breathing was slow and steady, each exhale warm against the cool air of the night outside. The wind moved through the pasture grass with a low whisper, like the land itself shifting in its sleep. I leaned my head back against the wooden rail and closed my eyes. For months I had been running from the barn, from the injury, from the version of myself that had existed before everything fell apart. But sitting there on the dirt floor with Atlas beside me, something strange began to happen. The memories didn't feel sharp anymore, they felt distant, like waves breaking far out at sea. You always did have terrible patience, I murmured softly. Atlas shifted his weight, the sound of his hoof pressing into the packed earth echoing faintly in the stall. I tilted my head back and looked up at him. His dark eyes reflected the lantern flame. Again, still watching, still waiting. You're not moving, are you? He blinked slowly. I huffed out a quiet breath. Figures. Another long silence stretched across the barn. Then, slowly, I pushed myself up from the floor. Dust clung to my jeans as I brushed my hands together. Atlas watched the entire time. I stepped closer to him. All right, I said quietly, if we're staying, we might as well do something. His ears flicked forward. I reached for the halter hanging on the stall wall. The leather creaked softly as I lifted it down. The familiar weight of it in my hands sent a strange warmth through my chest. How many times had I done this? Hundreds, thousands. Maybe a muscle memory took over. I slipped the halter gently over Atlas's head. He didn't resist, not even slightly. He simply lowered his head to make it easier. I paused for a moment. You trust me that much? Huh? His breath brushed my sleeve again. I clipped the lead rope to the halter ring. The metal snapped softly into place. Then I turned toward the stall doorway. Atlas shifted immediately, stepping aside just enough. I blinked. You're kidding. For hours he had stood there, like a wall, and now that I had decided to stay a little longer, he simply moved. I stared at him in disbelief. You're unbelievable. But there was something else now too, something softer, like he had been waiting for exactly this moment. I stepped into the barn aisle and gently tugged the lead rope. Come on. Atlas followed without hesitation. His hooves thudded softly against the dirt floor as we walked down the long row of empty stalls. The lantern light swayed slightly behind us. Each step echoed in the quiet. I stopped near the barn doors and slid them open. The cool night air rushed inside. The moon had climbed higher in the sky, pale and bright between drifting clouds. The pasture stretched out in silver shadows. Atlas stepped beside me. His breath steamed faintly in the cold air. For a moment, we both just stood there listening. The world outside the barn felt enormous, still and peaceful. I rested my hand against his neck. You remember this field? Of course he did. This was where everything had started, where I learned how to ride without fear, where we raced the wind just for the joy of it. I led him slowly out into the pasture. The grass brushed softly against my boots. Atlas walked beside me, calm and steady. We moved toward the center of the field. The sky above us stretched wide and endless as stars scattered across the darkness like quiet promises. I stopped and turned toward him. His silhouette looked enormous under the moonlight, powerful, beautiful. You carried me through everything, I whispered. Atlas lowered his head slightly. The lead rope hung loose between us. I reached up and ran my hand through his thick mane. It was tangled from the wind, just the way it always had been after long rides. You never cared if I was winning or losing. The words came out slowly and carefully. You never cared if I was the best rider in the arena. Atlas exhaled softly, warm breath drifting across the night air. You just cared that I showed up. A sudden tightness filled my throat. For months I had believed the injury had taken everything from me, my future, my identity, my place in the world. But standing there in the moonlit pasture, something began to shift. Maybe the path hadn't ended. Maybe it had simply changed direction. Atlas nudged my shoulder gently. The motion pulled me out of my thoughts. I laughed quietly.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hear you. I unclipped the lead rope and let it fall. Atlas remained beside me free, but he didn't move away. Instead, he simply stood there, waiting. The wind moved softly through the tall grass. I looked up at the sky again. When I left, I murmured, I thought I was closing the door on this place. On the barn, on the horses, on the girl who once believed the world was wide and full of possibility. But now the idea of leaving felt different, less certain, less necessary. Atlas shifted slightly closer, his shoulder brushed gently against mine, and suddenly a memory surfaced. Point one I hadn't thought about in years. Mr. Halverson standing beside the pasture fence one evening, watching Atlas and me race across the field. He had smiled and said something I didn't fully understand back then. Some partnerships aren't about winning, he said, they're about remembering who you are. I closed my eyes for a moment, the memory settled deep in my chest. I think I forgot that, I whispered. Atlas flicked his ears, the wind carried the faint scent of rain somewhere far away. I took a slow breath, then another. The heaviness that had followed me for months didn't disappear completely, but it loosened, just enough that I rested my forehead gently against Atlas's neck. The warmth of him felt grounding, real. Thank you, I murmured. He shifted slightly but didn't pull away. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time moved differently out there under the open sky. Eventually I stepped back and looked at him again. His dark eyes watched me calmly, not demanding, not expecting, just present, and for the first time in a long time, I felt present too, not stuck in the past, not running towards some uncertain future, just here I end the quiet field, with the horse who had refused to let me disappear. I reached up and scratched the base of his mane. You know, I said softly, I still have that new apartment waiting for me. Atlas blinked. I still have that job in the city too. He snorted lightly. I smiled, but maybe leaving doesn't have to mean forgetting. The idea felt strange at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Maybe life wasn't about choosing one version of yourself and abandoning the rest. Maybe it was about carrying those pieces forward, letting them evolve. Atlas lowered his head again and nudged my shoulder. I laughed softly. All right. I get it. The horizon in the distance had begun to lighten ever so slightly, the faintest hint of dawn. We had been out there for hours. The night that once felt heavy and uncertain was slowly giving way to morning. I clipped the lead rope back onto Atlas's halter. Come on, big guy. He followed easily as we walked back toward the barn. The sky behind us grew a shade lighter with every step. Birds began to stir faintly in the trees along the fence line. By the time we reached the stable doors, the world felt different, not brighter exactly, but clearer. Inside the barn, the lantern had nearly burned out. I led Atlas back into his stall. He stepped inside calmly, the same quiet presence filling the space. I removed the halter and hung it back on the wall. For a moment, we simply stood there again, the familiar warmth of the stall wrapped around us. I rested my hand against his neck one last time. You didn't let me go tonight. Atlas exhaled softly. And I think I'm glad you didn't. The first rays of dawn slipped through the cracks in the barn walls, golden light stretching across the floor. I turned toward the stall door. This time Atlas didn't block it, he simply watched me. But something in his gaze felt different, like he knew, like the decision had already been made. I stepped out into the aisle. My boots echoed softly against the dirt floor as I walked toward the barn doors. Outside, the morning sky was turning pale blue. The world smelled fresh, alive. I paused at the threshold and looked back. Atlas stood quietly in his stall, strong, steady, exactly where he had always been. A small smile touched my lips. I'll be back, I said softly, not as a promise to him, but as a promise to myself. Then I stepped outside into the growing light, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was leaving anything behind, because some bonds don't end, some nights don't fade, and some horses simply refuse to let you lose your way. The morning air felt different the moment I stepped out of the barn, cooler, sharper, alive in a way the night hadn't been. For a few seconds I just stood there on the worn wooden threshold, breathing in the scent of damp grass and distant trees. Dawn was spreading slowly across the horizon, pale gold spilling over the hills like quiet fire. The pasture looked softer now. The shadows that had seemed heavy and mysterious a few hours ago had faded into gentle shapes across the field. I walked down the gravel path toward my car, the small stones crunching beneath my boots. But halfway there, I stopped. Something tugged at me, not a sound, not movement, just a feeling, the kind you recognize before you understand. I turned slowly. The barn doors were still open behind me. Inside, the stalls rested in warm bands of morning light that slipped through the cracks in the wooden walls. And though I couldn't see him clearly from here, I knew exactly where Atlas was standing, still in that last stall, still watching. The thought made my chest tighten in a strange, unfamiliar way. I had come here tonight to close a door. To say
Goodbye.
to make it easier to step into a new life that had nothing to do with this place. But standing there in the pale morning light, I realized something important. Goodbyes don't always look the way we expect them to. Sometimes they don't happen at all. Sometimes they quietly turn into something else. I rubbed my hands together, warming them against the cool air, and let out a slow breath. You're ridiculous, you know that? I muttered to the empty yard, because deep down I knew exactly what had happened. Atlas hadn't forced me to stay. He hadn't trapped me. He had simply stood there long enough for me to stop running, and once I stopped running, everything looked different. I walked back toward the barn, not quickly, not dramatically, just step by step, gravel crunching underfoot again. When I reached the doorway, the smell of hay wrapped around me like an old memory. The lantern inside had finally burned out, but the sunrise lit the aisle in soft gold. Atlas stood exactly where I expected him to be. I in the last stall, head lifted. Watching. When he saw me return, his ears pricked forward slightly. That was all. No dramatic movement and no restless pacing, just quiet recognition. I leaned against the stall rail and smiled faintly. You didn't think I'd leave that easily, did you? Atlas blinked slowly. I studied him in the daylight. He looked different somehow. Or maybe I did. The black of his coat glowed softly in the morning light, and the scar near his shoulder caught the sun in a pale line. He was older now. So was I, but the steady calm in his presence hadn't changed. I rested my arms on the rail. You know what's funny? I said quietly, I spent months thinking the worst thing that happened to me was losing that competition career. Atlas flicked an ear. But maybe the worst thing was believing that was the only version of my life that mattered. The barn creaked softly as the wind brushed along the roof. Somewhere outside a bird began singing. A simple sound, clear and bright. I watched Atlas breathe slowly in the quiet stall. You never cared about medals, I murmured. You never cared about crowds or judges or ribbons. Another breath left my chest, and yet riding you was always the best part. A strange warmth settled in my chest again, not excitement, not relief. Exactly, something steadier, like a path slowly appearing through fog. I thought about the city waiting for me, the apartment, the job, the life I had carefully built as a replacement for the one that had collapsed. Maybe that life still mattered, maybe it would still be part of my future, but it didn't have to erase this one. I reached through the stall rail and scratched Atlas gently behind the ear. He leaned slightly into the touch. You know, I said thoughtfully, there's a riding school about 20 minutes from the apartment. Atlas snorted softly and I laughed. I'm serious. The idea had appeared suddenly, but it felt right. Not the high-pressure world of competitions and rankings, just riding, teaching, maybe helping someone else feel what I felt the first time I trusted a horse to carry me forward. That might not be such a bad life, I admitted. Atlas nudged my hand gently and I took that as approval. The morning light brightened across the barn floor. Dust swirled slowly in the beams of sunlight. I stepped back from the stall rail and stretched my arms. Well, I said, looks like you did your job. Atlas blinked again, calm, patient, like he had known all along that this night wasn't about stopping me from leaving. It was about reminding me who I was before I decided to run. I turned toward the barn doors once more. This time the walk toward my car felt different, not heavy, not final, just the next step. When I reached the gravel driveway, I paused one last time and looked back. The barn stood quietly under the growing morning sky, old, weathered, still full of life. Somewhere inside, Atlas shifted in his stall, and even from here I could almost feel the steady rhythm of his presence. A quiet anchor in a world that had once felt like it was spinning apart. I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. The engine started with a low hum, but before pulling away, I glanced once more toward the barn. A smile touched my lips. See you soon, I whispered. Then I drove slowly down the gravel road as the sun rose fully over the hills, and for the first time since everything changed, the future didn't feel like something I had to Escape .it felt like something I could walk toward, step by step, just like the first time a black horse carried a frightened girl across an open field and taught her what it meant to trust the road ahead.